Consider what it is before we explain what it did. Open cockpit, fabric fuselage, wire bracing between the wings. A biplane built in the style of the First World War, carrying a single torpedo at a top speed of approximately 90 miles per hour, less than you would drive on a motorway in a hurry. Its crews called it the string bag. By 1941, it was already considered obsolete by everyone who had to fly it and everyone who had to defend against it. Now, consider what it was flying toward. The most powerful warship in the world, on its first operational sortie into the North Atlantic, carrying 8 15-inch guns and armor plate built to withstand the heaviest weapons afloat. A ship no single vessel in the Royal Navy could have defeated in direct combat. Tell me in the comments, did you know it was a biplane that stopped the Bismarck? Because what you are about to discover will change how you understand what power actually means in war. Now let's go. On the 18th of May, 1941, the most powerful warship in the world prepared to go to work. Britain had been at war with Germany for 20 months. The United States had not yet entered the conflict. The island of Britain was surviving on a physical thread stretched across the North Atlantic. The convoys of merchant ships crossing from North America, carrying the food, the fuel, and the war material without which the country could not eat or fight. German submarines were sinking between 30 and 50 of those merchant ships every month. Britain was not losing the war, but it was losing the war at sea in a way that would eventually make every other front irrelevant. Operation Rheinübung, Rhine exercise, would send the battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen into the North Atlantic to attack the convoys the Royal Navy was escorting. Bismarck was powerful enough to destroy any convoy escort she encountered, and fast enough to evade any British battleship that came after her. The original plan had called for 4 capital ships operating together. Scharnhorst was in engine overhaul. Gneisenau had been torpedoed at Brest and was in dry dock. Tirpitz was not yet ready for combat. The force that sailed was half of what the plan had required. Admiral Günther Lutyens had argued against sailing. He wrote clearly that the operation as configured carried risks the available force could not manage. His superiors overruled him. That single fact, that the man commanding the operation said it was too dangerous and was sent anyway, is where the real history of the hunt for Bismarck begins. Bismarck herself was the largest warship in active service anywhere in the world. 823 feet from bow to stern, 8 15-inch main guns, armor plate built to resist the heaviest naval ordnance afloat, a top speed of 31 knots, displacing approximately 50,000 tons fully loaded. She had been in service for 277 days when she departed for the Atlantic. She would be in service for 277 days total. Lutyens was reserved rather than flamboyant, thorough rather than intuitive, possessed of a professional fatalism those who served under him described not as defeatism, but as a refusal to pretend that war did not cost what it cost. On the 5th of May, 1941, when Adolf Hitler visited Bismarck for an inspection dinner and declared that the United States would never enter the war against Germany, Lutyens contradicted him directly at the table. His rank was not high enough to make this an entirely safe thing to say. He said it anyway. Kapitän zur See Ernst Lindemann was Bismarck's first and only captain. He instructed his officers to call the ship he rather than she. The ship was too powerful, he believed, to be called female, a small choice of pronoun that reveals the particular nature of his devotion to what he commanded. He was last seen alive standing on the overturned bow of the capsizing ship, talking calmly with a crewman as the hull went over. The ship that gave the coming engagement its emotional dimension was HMS Hood. The largest vessel in the Royal Navy, launched in 1918, she had become something greater than a warship. More than 10,000 men had served aboard her in 2 decades. She was the capital of the Royal Navy's symbolic account, the visible demonstration that British naval power still reached everywhere that mattered. What the public did not know, because the Admiralty had not told them, was that Hood's deck armor at the most vulnerable point, between the funnels, measured only 3 inches. This vulnerability had been identified and documented within the naval architecture community for more than 20 years. Modification proposals had been prepared. The modifications had been repeatedly deferred. Hood went to sea as the embodiment of British naval supremacy, not a ship that had never been properly armored for the engagement that was now coming, a ship that looked, from the outside, as though it had. HMS Prince of Wales was so new that civilian contractors from the shipbuilding yard were still aboard when the sailing orders came, attempting to resolve a persistent malfunction in her main gun turrets. The work was not completed before the ship left harbor. On the 18th of May, Prince Eugen departed Gotenhafen at approximately 9 in the evening. Bismarck followed at 2 in the morning on the 19th. They turned north through the Kattegat toward Norway. The plan was to pass through without being observed. It lasted approximately 24 hours. Norwegian resistance observers spotted both ships and reported their position. The information passed through Swedish naval intelligence to the British naval attaché in Stockholm, who transmitted it to the Admiralty within hours. A Royal Air Force Spitfire on photographic reconnaissance duties located both ships at Grimstad Fjord near Bergen. When British bombers arrived in response, the ships were already gone. Bismarck had not refueled at Bergen. Lutyens, for reasons that have never been satisfactorily explained, chose not to top off her tanks despite the opportunity being available. In the days that followed, every ton of fuel became consequential. At 7:22 in the evening on the 23rd of May, HMS Suffolk sighted Bismarck and Prince Eugen 7 miles ahead in the Denmark Strait, the narrow passage between Iceland and Greenland. She took cover in a fog bank, transmitted her sighting report, and then did the most valuable thing an outgunned ship can do. She stayed close without closing. HMS Norfolk joined the shadowing force. When Norfolk got too close, Bismarck opened fire. The recoil from Bismarck firing her own main guns knocked out her forward-looking radar. Prince Eugen moved into the lead position. The 2 British cruisers settled in behind, maintaining contact by radar, feeding Bismarck's position back to the Admiralty, and waiting for the forces that could actually do something about what they had found. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland intercepted the German ships in the early hours of the 24th of May and steered to engage them. At 5:52 in the morning, the battle opened. Holland had positioned his force for a charge at the enemy, rather than a maneuver to bring his full broadside to bear. He was trying to close the range as rapidly as possible, aware that Hood's thin deck plating made her vulnerable to long-range plunging fire. The consequence was that only Hood's forward turrets could bear on the target, cutting his effective firepower by roughly half. Prince of Wales had a further problem. One of her main turret guns failed during the engagement. The malfunction her civilian contractors had not resolved before the battle, and Holland's gun directors initially targeted Prince Eugen, misidentified as Bismarck, meaning the first British salvos were directed at the wrong ship entirely. Lutyens ordered a hard turn to bring both German vessels broadside. Their combined fire concentrated on Hood. An early hit from Prince Eugen struck Hood's shelter deck and started a fire among the ready-use ammunition for the anti-aircraft weapons. The ship was not yet mortally wounded. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, Bismarck's salvo found Hood at the point the designers had left most exposed, between the funnels, where her plating measured only 3 inches. 1 or more shells penetrated through several decks and into the aft magazine. Hundreds of tons of high explosive and propellant charges ignited simultaneously. The column of flame that rose from Hood reached 1,000 feet into the morning sky. The ship broke in 2. She sank in under 3 minutes. Of her crew of 1,000, 415 men, 3 survived. 3. They were Ordinary Seaman Ted Briggs, 18 years old, stationed near the bridge. Able Seaman Robert Tilburn at the torpedo tubes. Midshipman William Dundas, who survived by kicking out a window in the rapidly listing ship and fighting clear of the suction as she went under. Ted Briggs described the experience this way. When Hood's list reached 30 degrees, he understood that the ship was not coming back. He had not heard the explosion that preceded it. He felt the list. He saw flame around the compass platform. Then the sea took him down, and for reasons he never explained, released him upward, so that when he surfaced, 50 yards away, he could see Hood's bow standing vertical above the water before it disappeared. He was one of 3 men alive from a crew of 1,415. Bismarck and Prince Eugen turned their guns on Prince of Wales. The new battleship withdrew under a smokescreen, but not before scoring 3 hits on Bismarck. 1 shell penetrated the bow. Another ruptured oil tanks, contaminating part of the fuel supply and starting a leak the crew could not stop at sea. The oil trailed from Bismarck's hull in a visible slick on the surface of the strait. Those 3 hits would prove to be the wound that made everything else possible. Churchill's order to the Admiralty was 4 words: sink the Bismarck. Every warship that could be redirected was redirected. Convoys were stripped of their escorts. The destruction of Hood had produced, throughout the Navy, a controlled and specific fury that the chain of command now translated into the largest single pursuit operation in the history of the Royal Navy. Lutjens made for France. He sent Prince Eugen south to continue the original mission alone and resumed course for Saint-Nazaire, the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast capable of handling a ship of Bismarck's size. That evening, 9 Swordfish torpedo bombers from HMS Victorious, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, found the German battleship in the dark and attacked. They scored 1 torpedo hit, striking the armored belt, the strongest section of the ship. It did not slow Bismarck or alter her course. All 9 Swordfish returned. Note the name, Eugene Esmond. He will appear again in this account. What happened when he did does not have a comfortable ending. At approximately 3 in the morning on the 25th of May, HMS Suffolk lost radar contact with Bismarck. In the darkness and the heavy seas, Bismarck had looped behind the shadowing cruiser. The radar signal disappeared. Bismarck was gone. Tovey's immediate assessment was that she was retreating northeast toward German waters. He turned the home fleet in that direction. He was wrong. Bismarck had turned for the French coast. The 2 forces were moving apart across a vast ocean, and the British did not know it. On the morning of the 25th of May, 1941, Admiral Günther Lütjens turned 52 years old. He did not know the British had lost him. Based on his reading of the radar tracking reports HMS Suffolk had been transmitting throughout the shadowing operation, he was convinced that British radar was still following him. He had dramatically overestimated its effective range. He was in radio silence. He believed it futile. On his 52nd birthday, in the mistaken certainty that the British could already see him, Lütjens broke that silence and transmitted a long coded message to Naval Command in Germany. Radio direction finding stations in Britain and Ireland intercepted the signals immediately. Bearings were determined and transmitted to Tovey. His navigation officer plotted the bearings on the chart and got it wrong. The calculations placed Bismarck heading northeast toward Norway when she was actually heading southeast toward France. Tovey changed course. The entire home fleet followed him at full speed in the wrong direction. 7 hours passed before the error was identified and corrected. During those 7 hours, burning fuel that could not be recovered, the home fleet moved away from Bismarck, while Bismarck moved steadily toward France. When Tovey finally turned south, Bismarck had extended her lead considerably. The picture was clarifying through other channels. British codebreakers, including analyst Jane Fawcett at Bletchley Park, decrypted a German signal indicating Bismarck was making for Brest. The French resistance separately confirmed that Luftwaffe units were relocating to the Brest area, a corroborating signal from a completely independent source. Bismarck was running south. By nightfall, on the 26th of May, she would be within Luftwaffe fighter range. By the morning of the 27th, she would be in safe waters. There was approximately 1 day remaining. At 10:25 in the morning on the 26th of May, a Catalina flying boat of 209th Squadron, Royal Air Force, found Bismarck 700 miles west of Brest. 31 hours after contact had been lost, she was found. The pilot was Pilot Officer Dennis Briggs of the Royal Air Force. His co-pilot was Ensign Leonard Tuck Smith of the United States Navy. America was not yet at war. The presence of an American naval officer in a British military aircraft on a combat patrol was diplomatically irregular. It was not discussed publicly. Bismarck opened fire as soon as the Catalina appeared. Briggs transmitted a sighting report before losing the ship in the weather and turning for base. The only British force capable of slowing Bismarck before she reached safe waters was HMS Ark Royal, approaching from Gibraltar. Her aircraft complement was a collection of Fairey Swordfish biplanes. Nobody expected much from the Swordfish, but there was nothing else. In the mid-afternoon, 15 Swordfish launched from Ark Royal for the first strike. Gale force winds, waves surging between 25 and 40 feet high, cloud base too low to maintain formation. The pilots flew separately through the overcast, broke through beneath the cloud, and found a large vessel below them. They identified it as Bismarck. It was HMS Sheffield. The British cruiser was positioned between Ark Royal and the German battleship. The pilots had attacked the wrong ship. The magnetic detonators fitted to their torpedoes failed on contact with the sea surface, most exploding harmlessly as they struck the waves. Sheffield evaded the remainder. No damage was done. As the Swordfish turned away and regrouped, one pilot radioed Sheffield an apology about the kipper. The aircraft landed back on Ark Royal and were rearmed. The magnetic detonators were replaced with contact detonators, a simpler mechanism that detonated on solid impact. At 10 minutes past 7 in the evening of the 26th of May, the 15 Swordfish launched again. The 3 flights separated in the overcast and attacked independently. The fire from Bismarck was intense, every gun with an angle brought to bear on aircraft, flying low and slow through the murk. One Swordfish returned to Ark Royal with 175 holes in its airframe, but Bismarck's anti-aircraft shells had been fused to detonate at aircraft velocities significantly greater than the Swordfish could achieve. The shells that struck the fabric fuselage passed through the canvas without triggering their fuses. Not a single Swordfish was lost. 3 torpedoes struck the ship. The first hit the port side amidships, striking the armored belt. No serious damage. The second struck the port quarter. The third was dropped by Sub-Lieutenant John Moffett of 818th Naval Air Squadron. He was 21 years old. His observer was Sub-Lieutenant Dusty Miller. His telegraphist air gunner was Albert Heyman. Moffett bored in through the anti-aircraft fire at approximately 50 feet above the wave tops, and Miller tracked the geometry of the approach, calling for him to hold until the moment when the numbers were correct, then gave the signal to release. The torpedo ran toward Bismarck's stern and struck just above the port rudder, at the point where the hull narrowed toward the ship's tail, a section shaped for hydrodynamic efficiency rather than armored for protection. The one area the designers had left undefended because they had not expected any weapon to reach it. The explosion jammed Bismarck's twin rudders at 10 to 15 degrees to port. The steering gear was irretrievably wrecked. Bismarck could only steam in a slow, counterclockwise circle. She could not be steered toward France. She could not be steered toward safety. She could only circle in the open ocean while the home fleet closed. All 15 Swordfish returned to Ark Royal. 3 crashed on landing on the pitching deck. Every man came home. Through the night, British destroyers and the Polish destroyer ORP Piorin, her crew fighting under a flag that no longer flew over Warsaw, circled Bismarck in the darkness, delivering torpedo and gunfire attacks. None caused serious damage. What they accomplished was not physical. They kept Bismarck's crew on deck through the night, forcing continuous defensive action and denying the rest that the men inside would need before the morning they all understood was coming. Inside the ship, engineering teams worked through those same hours in flooded spaces in the stern section, attempting to force the jammed rudder mechanism free. Every option the engineering officers could identify had been tried and had failed. The rudder could not be freed. Lutyens transmitted his final signal to Naval Command in Germany. The ship was unmaneuverable, he reported. They would fight to the last shell. He ended with a declaration for the Führer. What the crew understood in the hours before dawn was not put into writing in any document that survived the sinking. It is present in the survivor testimonies without ever being stated directly. At 8:47 in the morning, on the 27th of May, 1941, HMS King George V and HMS Rodney opened fire on Bismarck at a range of 12 miles. Bismarck, turning in her slow, unsteerable circle, could not maneuver. She could only accept the approach and respond. Her gunnery in the opening phase was coherent and accurate. Her first salvos fell close to the British ships. Neither British battleship was hit. Even disabled, circling without steerage way, with a damaged bow and contaminated fuel tanks and a crew on deck through the long, harassing night, Bismarck was fighting as her crew had been trained to fight. The British closed the range, from 12 miles to 2 miles, from 2 miles to approximately 3,000 yards, closer than any British capital ship had engaged an enemy capital ship in the modern era of naval warfare. At 3,000 yards, Rodney's 9 16-inch guns, the largest caliber in the Royal Navy, were firing point-blank into the ship that could not turn away from them. At approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, a salvo from Rodney found Bismarck's bridge. Admiral Günther Lutyens, 52 years old, 2 days past the birthday on which he had broken radio silence and handed the British the bearing that led them here, was killed. Kapitän zur See Ernst Lindemann, 47 years old, the only commanding officer Bismarck had ever had, the man who had told his officers the ship was too powerful to be called she, died with him. Most of the senior officers on the bridge were killed in the same moment. At 9:31 in the morning, Bismarck's guns fell silent. By 10 o'clock, the ship was a burning wreck, listing heavily, superstructure destroyed. Approximately 700 main battery rounds and nearly 3,000 shells of various calibers had been fired at her. At least 400 had struck home. Tovey's ships were now critically low on fuel. He ordered HMS Dorsetshire to finish the ship with torpedoes. In Bismarck's engine rooms, engineering officer Gerhard Unach opened sea valves and detonated scuttling charges. Dorsetshire fired 3 torpedoes, 2 into the port side, 1 into the starboard. They struck a ship that was already sinking. At 10:39 in the morning on the 27th of May, 1941, Bismarck capsized and sank. 277 days from her commissioning. 215 hours for her single operational sortie from departure to end. Hundreds of men were in the water. From a crew of over 2,000, the majority were in the North Atlantic, most of them wounded, most in the early stages of hypothermia, surrounded by oil and the debris of Bismarck's shattered superstructure. The sea temperature in that part of the ocean in late May was cold enough to kill an unprotected man within an hour. HMS Dorsetshire and destroyer HMS Maury moved in. Scrambling nets were slung over the sides. The crew hauled men from the oil-covered sea one at a time. Then a lookout reported a periscope. German submarines had been positioned in the area to support Bismarck. The captains of Dorsetshire and Maori ordered immediate departure. Robes still holding men who had not yet been hauled aboard were cut. The ships moved away, leaving the men in the water behind them. Dorsetshire rescued approximately 85 survivors. Maori rescued 25. Later, U-74 arrived and recovered 5 more. The German weather ship Sachsenwald found 2. From a crew of over 2,000 men, 115 survived. Whether the periscope sighting was genuine has never been definitively established. The captains made their decision in seconds and had no mechanism for a longer deliberation. Whether they were right will never be known. The question of what exactly sank Bismarck, British shells, British torpedoes, or German scuttling charges became one of the more persistent arguments in the naval historical literature. On the 8th of June, 1989, 48 years after the sinking, Robert Ballard located Bismarck on the ocean floor at approximately 15,000 feet, on the flank of an extinct underwater volcano roughly 400 miles west of Brest. What he found was not what he had expected. The hull was largely intact, with no evidence of the implosive damage that occurs when a ship sinks before being fully flooded. The condition of the hull indicated the ship's compartments had been opened to the sea before she sank. His conclusion? He believed she had been scuttled. The press received this with evident horror. Ballard subsequently suggested that the argument over whether the British or the Germans had sunk her was an exercise in splitting hairs. Both things were happening simultaneously. The sea received all contributions at once. The strategic consequences were immediate and permanent. The Kriegsmarine never again sent a major capital ship into the North Atlantic to attack the convoy routes. Bismarck's sister ship, Tirpitz, spent the remainder of the war sheltered in Norwegian fjords and never fired her main guns at an enemy warship in the open sea. The scheme that Lutyens had argued against and been ordered to execute anyway died with him in the water that morning. The man who led the first swordfish attack against Bismarck led another swordfish attack 9 months later. On the 12th of February, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, 32 years old, led 6 swordfish against Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prince Eugen as they made their dash through the English Channel in daylight. Esmond had asked for adequate fighter cover. What arrived was not adequate. He was told to proceed. He knew what the mathematics of the attack looked like. He went anyway, because the order had been given, and he was the man tasked with carrying it out. All 6 swordfish were shot down within minutes. Esmond was killed. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. The same aircraft, the same courage, a different outcome, for no reason that flatters any comfortable theory about bravery and what it earns. The ships did not outlast the year. HMS Prince of Wales was sunk by Japanese torpedo bombers off Malaya on the 10th of December, 1941. HMS Ark Royal, the carrier from whose deck the Swordfish had launched, was torpedoed by the German submarine U-81 off Gibraltar on the 13th of November, 1941. HMS Dorsetshire, which had fired the final torpedoes into Bismarck and pulled 85 of her crew from the water, was sunk by Japanese carrier aircraft near Ceylon on the 5th of April, 1942. Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg, who had served as aide to the German military attaché in London before the war, who knew England and the English from peacetime, who had taken control of Bismarck's aft turrets in the final minutes after the bridge was destroyed and the admiral was dead, was rescued by HMS Dorsetshire and eventually held in a prisoner of war camp in Canada until April 1945. After the war, he became a German diplomat. In 1980, he published the account that has become the definitive record of Bismarck's last hours from inside the ship. He lived to old age. In 2011, John Moffat, the pilot most credited with dropping the torpedo that jammed Bismarck's rudder, visited 820th Naval Air Squadron at Royal Naval Air Station Culdrose in Cornwall. He was 92 years old. He had been 21 years old in the cockpit. 70 years is a long interval between those two men, but on the day he walked back into the hangar at Culdrose, both of them were present. The wreck of Bismarck sits on the slope of an underwater volcano in the North Atlantic, approximately 15,000 feet below the surface, roughly 400 miles west of Brest. Robert Ballard kept the exact coordinates from the public and transmitted them to the German government. He held a memorial service over the wreck for those lost on both Hood and Bismarck, 2 enemy warships, 2 crews, several thousand men, all in the same ocean, killed by the same conflict from opposite sides of it. The main gun turrets, each weighing more than 1,000 tons, lie scattered on the seabed below the hull, having fallen from their barbettes as the ship capsized on the way down. The tides have been moving over them for 84 years. The Swordfish that jammed Bismarck's rudder flew at approximately 90 miles per hour. Bismarck displaced 50,000 tons and mounted 8 15-inch guns and had been built to withstand every weapon afloat. The question asked at the beginning of this account was, how does the first thing destroy the second? The answer is not a satisfying one if you are looking for a story in which superior force prevails and sound planning is rewarded. Britain won the hunt for Bismarck by the narrowest of margins, through a chain of errors on both sides that went wrong in the right order at the right moments. Lutyens argued against sailing and was overruled. He did not refuel at Bergen. He broke radio silence on his birthday when he did not need to. Tovey's navigation officer sent the entire home fleet in the wrong direction for 7 hours. The first Swordfish strike attacked the wrong ship, and then, in a gale, in the failing light of the 26th of May, 15 men in a fabric-covered biplane found the one undefended point on the most armored warship in the world, the one place nobody had remembered to protect, because nobody had expected anything as slow as a swordfish to get close enough to matter and put a torpedo in it, because there was nobody else. The names of the men it cost: Gunther Lutyens, 52 years old; Ernst Lindemann, 47; 1,415 men aboard HMS Hood, over 2,000 men aboard Bismarck; Eugene Esmond, 32, who flew the same aircraft 9 months later and did not come back. All of them in the North Atlantic in May and June of 1941, in a chain of events set in motion when someone in Berlin decided to sail a single ship rather than wait for the force that might have made the operation something other than what it became. The wreck does not move. The tides move over it. The gun turrets are where they fell. If you want to understand what the war at sea actually cost on both sides, beyond the famous ships and the famous names, watch this next.